Our Debunking the Seven Myths program is designed for students 11th grade through college. This program addresses the 7 leading myths about Genesis, creation, and the flood that are taught in today's colleges, even some Christian colleges. Now let's compare the biblical flood to the leading flood myth, the Epic of Gilgamesh. In 1853, archaeologists found a series of 12 tablets dated to around 650 BC, although parts of the story existed in earlier fragmentary versions. Because the story had many of the same elements as the Genesis account, skeptics believed that Gilgamesh preceded the biblical account, negating the Genesis account as just a spin-off. Fortunately for Christians, however, there are major clues that point to the biblical account as the accurate one, and Gilgamesh as a later work of fiction that incorporated legendary elements of a flood within a cultural fantasy.
I don't know. I'm kind of thinking it's the other way around.
We've had it all backwards.
Here are the reasons why. First, we have the feasibility of the Gilgamesh version of the Ark, described as a massive, unstable cube that was about 200 feet on each side with 6 decks that divided it into 7 parts. Along with help from the community and craftsmen, he supposedly built this vessel, which was over 3 times the size of the biblical Ark, in just a week. How would something like this fare during a catastrophic worldwide flood? It would obviously tumble, killing or maiming its passengers. That's obviously quite different than the biblical Ark, which had a 7-to-1 length-to-width ratio, which is very similar to many of today's ocean barges, making a feasible design for staying afloat during the flood.
Remember that the Bible doesn't describe Noah's Ark as a ship or a boat, but as a box, just like the one in the Epic of Gilgamesh, except more elongated, because the biblical version is so much newer. Semitic people had heard these stories for thousands of years, and those who understood this to mean a cube said, you know, that wouldn't work very well. So by the time they got around to adapting the story for the Jewish religion, they gave it more reasonable dimensions. But it was still a box. It wouldn't have had a bow or a rudder or a keel, nor could it make use of these things since it didn't have any means of propulsion either. Now, as we showed in the previous episode of the series, over the last decade, at least a half-dozen livestock-carrying ships have sunk, all about the same size as Noah's Ark was supposed to be, except, of course, that they were built better out of much stronger materials. And most of these ships capsized. Why? In each case, it was due to engine failure. When you're on the high seas and waves come up with the storm, you have to be able to turn the ship to hit the waves head-on. But without any means of propulsion or steering, each of these ships were turned broadside to the waves, such that the next big one just rolled them over. So it doesn't matter what the dimensions were. Noah's rectangular box wouldn't have lasted 1 day, no matter how it was built.
Scripture provides clues that Noah and helpers likely had between 55 and 75 years to build the ark.
Some portions of these tales, or the precursors of them, were written in cuneiform. This was before the number 0 had been invented, so they used a base 60 numeric system, in which they used a subtle mark, like an apostrophe, that could be taken to mean 10 times the given number. For example, the Epic of Gilgamesh does not say that the walls of the ark were 120 cubits high. Instead, it says they were 10 times 12 cubits high. Because the mark that indicates the magnitude was just a subtle impression printed on pitted clay, it is now known that this was sometimes misread. And then the Hebrew tradition often determines ages based on lunar months rather than solar years, and these, of course, were mistranslated as well. So if the Bible says that Noah was 600 when he built the ark, and that he lived to 950 years old before we died, then if we divide by 10 to account for an apparent mistake in reading the base 60 system, then we're only talking about from when he was 60 to 95. Or if we divide by 12 to convert months into years, then that would mean that he was 50 to 79. Whichever way you do it, the ages are obviously much more reasonable. Except that Noah was supposed to be 500 years old when he had the first of his sons. Even accounting for strange counting systems and strange calendars, that would still make him 50 before having his first child? Obviously, that number is suspect too. Of course, apologists assume that he was really 500 years old, but that his oldest boy was only 20 or so before construction began. So many assumptions compiled atop nothing but other assumptions. And we know that virtually none of the numbers given in the Bible are reliable. The reason there are so many repetitions of 40 this and 40 that's and 7 times 7 of these is because the authors used these numbers for symbolic reasons, because these tales were written to be folklore, not literal history. But even if we allow a man to be 1,000 years old and give him 75 years to build this thing that is doomed to failure on its first day at sea, he still couldn't do it, not with 3 sons using Stone Age tools. Remember that it took 6 years for Answers in Genesis to build their mock-up, and that was using over 1,000 workers, skilled craftsmen with cranes and power tools and hundreds of tons of lumber being trucked in from all over the country. Noah would have had a hopeless task given the means that existed at the time imagined for this obvious fable.
The second key for determining which of these flood accounts is the original is the duration of the flood provided by each. The Gilgamesh flood lasted a mere 6 days, whereas the Genesis flood lasted 371 days. Both accounts claim the flood was worldwide, but how could water cover Earth in just 6 days?
Remember that the model that all these old myths, including the Bible, were using was that of a flat disk covered by a giant crystal firmament, wherein there is an infinite amount of water above the firmament, which doesn't exist, as well as more water below the pillars of the earth, which also don't exist. Now, they could have flooded the earth in minutes if the imaginary windows in the alleged firmament were big enough. That's not the problem. The problem is critics of the original story pointing out how it would have been possible to survive floating at sea for only a week, whether in another boat or just on debris. So the storytellers realized they would have to drag out the duration for longer than anyone else could have survived, even if they were on a good boat. That's why the original duration of the flood was extended to a year in the Bible.
A floating 200 by 200 foot cube and 6 days for worldwide inundation certainly stretch credulity.
What do believers even care about credulity? The whole purpose of faith is to make believe what you know is not true nor even possible.
Let me just ask you this question. Can snakes talk?
Can snakes talk? If you believe in a personal God and you believe in the supernatural, then you believe that there is the possibility that a snake can talk.
Are you stupid or something?
If somewhere within the Bible I were to find a passage that said 2 plus 2 equals 5, I wouldn't question what I'm reading in the Bible. I would believe it, accept it as true, and then do my best to work it out and to understand it.
Are you, out of your freaking mind?
The next consideration is the reasons for the flood given by each of the 2 accounts. In the Genesis account, God's judgment is just.
No, it isn't. God's so-called judgment in the Bible is never just. It's dubious at best, and in this story, it's wholly unacceptable. And first of all, Mr. Omniscient, who knows everything that ever will happen, was somehow surprised that people turned out the way we did, such that Mr. Infallible regretted the mistake that he made in creating humans. If he couldn't even see that coming, then it's no wonder that so many of the biblical prophecies failed as badly as they did. But of course, it gets worse than that. We are to believe that at the time that God got mad at what was really his own error, all of humanity still lived in the area of the Levant. At least according to the sacred fables, everyone in the world still lived in this circle. So there was much more efficient means that he could have used if he needed to wipe those people out. Methods that didn't require killing every sloth in South America and every baby deer in North America and every koala in Australia. Even a tactical nuke would have been more efficient and cost-effective than a flood. In fact, he could have just blinked them all out of existence, like he conjured everything out of nothing in the first place. But that's still the wrong answer, because he's still killing everyone. This is supposed to be our Father who loves us. We're told that God is love and wisdom, yet he never demonstrates either of these traits, always quite the opposite instead. A supreme being, even a superior being, would know the most appropriate response in all instances, so that his people would have a chance to learn the error of their ways in such a way that they could redeem themselves and come to love God the way that we come to love our fathers. But Jehovah is a deadbeat dad who went out one night and said he'd be right back very soon, but he never came back at all. You only love your father if he is part of your life, if he's really there, and you don't have to pretend that he's there. Instead of deciphering or imagining coded signs, he communicates like real people, sharing valuable lessons such that you come to respect his wisdom, generosity, and kindness, rather than fearing his wrath, or making excuses for why he never shows up like all the other dads do. You can't reason with a stupid God, because they're insecure and easily offended, and all they know how to do is smite. That's why the God of Abraham demands a death sentence for nearly every imagined infraction. If he really was all-powerful, then he wouldn't have such a fragile ego. Imagine raising your own kids the way our alleged Father in Heaven supposedly does. Well, Jimmy, I'm disappointed by that report card, so I'm going to have to kill you. And your sister. And the kids next door. What did they do? Doesn't matter. The only disciplinary tool I can think of is a nuclear bomb. So everyone in town is going to have to die, all except for your drunken cousin Eddie. I sent him down to the bomb shelter. This inexcusably cruel, incompetent idiocy is what you call just? No. It is just indefensible.
He was patient with utterly wicked mankind for 120 years before sending the flood, and showed mercy to the last righteous family.
Have you ever noticed that in each of those moments where the Bible says that God has to choose the one righteous man worth saving, both times it's been a blind drunk abusing and or molesting his own children and then blaming them for it? God is clearly not a good judge of character. He's not a good judge of anything.
In the Gilgamesh account, the flood was ordered by multiple self-centered squabbling gods that were starving without humans to feed them sacrifices. These two are quite different.
Yeah, because the Bible has only one self-centered God squabbling about how humans had better make burnt offerings to him, as if a God could really need or want a sacrifice. Actually, not even that is different, because Judaism, the religion on which Christianity is based, was originally polytheistic. The first monotheistic religion was Zoroastrianism, back when Jews had pantheons full of gods to choose from. Then they adopted monotheism, just as Pharaoh Akhenaten did too. And you still see hints of former polytheism reflected in the Bible, like the fierce rivalry with the Baal worshippers and the occasional reference to Jehovah's ex-wife Asherah and other all but forgotten subtleties hidden in the text.
Finally, there are several other parts of the Gilgamesh account that are obviously mythical, such as Gilgamesh being 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal.
Nearly all mythologies include a tale of half-human god-men, including Christianity. This fact was even admitted by one of the early church fathers, who said that the stories about Jesus weren't significantly different than Greek mythology of that time. And remember also that the story about Jesus multiplying loaves and fishes is a repeat of the same story at different times, where those who were at both events acted like they'd never seen it before. And the tale of him cursing the fig tree and freeing the adulteress are both known interpolations that never happened and were added by other authors later on.
After oppressing his people, Gilgamesh and others called upon the gods, and the sky god Anu creates a wild man named Enkidu to fight Gilgamesh. The battle is a draw, and they become friends.
More than that, this epic implies that King Gilgamesh and the beast man Enkidu became very close, to the point that they even slept together in the same bed, because Enkidu was a wild thing, and a real man's man. Specifically, he was the king's man.
Gilgamesh apparently also encounters talking monsters and a scorpion man in his journeys.
While the Bible talks about a talking snake, and also a talking donkey, as well as fire-breathing dragons, and witches, and wizards, and sticks turning into snakes, and a man being created by a golem spell, and an army of the undead being reanimated by the incantation of a necromancer. There's even a story about a man living for 3 days inside a whale that the Bible authors mistook for a fish.
Many myths are based on historical accounts, but they get embellished over time, becoming more and more mythical as the story is repeated over generations. This is exactly what we see with flood myths like Gilgamesh.
No, that's what we see in the Bible, where a historic event, a torrential storm of impressive severity, was exaggerated to impossible, mythical proportions despite all evidence to the contrary.
They take the original historical account, the biblical flood, and grow it into a mythical, interesting story over time.
We don't have the original historical account. The closest we have is one vague reference to Ziusudra, son of Ubartutu, in the Sumerian king list, which scholars say is about 1,800 years older than the story of Noah's Ark, yet still 500 years after the reported fact. Ubartutu was the king of Shuruppak, which was evidently the site of the original flood. The Epic of Gilgamesh also places the flood in Shuruppak. And even though it changed Ziusudra's name to Utnapishtim, it still recognizes him as the son of Ubartutu. It also mentions the name of Atrahasis, which is another name for the Noah character from another version of the same story to be written centuries later. Although the flood story in the Eridu Genesis keeps the name of Ziusudra as the main character, so we know which story they're talking about, and it's not Noah's Ark. The Sumerian king list says that 8 kings ruled over parts of Mesopotamia for a total of 385,200 years in succession. That's obviously impossible. Now, if you divide by 100, because each of these numbers end in a suspicious double zero, all of them, they're all rounded to a double zero, and how likely is that? Then divide by 12, adjusting for the lunar calendar, then we can see that these 8 kings more likely ruled for an average of 40 years each over a period of just 3 centuries. Importantly, after the flood, the very next king is not Ziusudra, but Jushur, who set the new capital in Kish. Jushur ruled for 1,200 years all by himself, which again, dividing by 100 and then dividing by 12 means he probably only ruled for 1 year, 12 months. Otherwise, we don't have any historic data on the flood of Shuruppak. All we know about that is what archaeologists can tell us, that the actual flood in question was a localized inundation of the Euphrates River in about 2900 BCE, showing that all these older versions of the story were much more accurate, pertaining to a torrential potential hurricane lasting about a week. And funny thing, the depth of that flood was determined to be 15 cubits, or 22 feet. This was what the archaeologists determined, 15 cubits, or 22 feet. Same as what the Bible says. But you know, storytellers like to embellish their tall tales, exaggerating sometimes until a couple thousand years later, when the Bible now says that just 22 feet of water somehow flooded the whole world.
For example, the earlier version of the Gilgamesh flood account clearly identifies the flood as a local river flood, with the dead bodies of humans filling the river like dragonflies, and moving to the edge of the boat like a raft, and moving to the riverbank like a raft.
That's not the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's the Epic of Atrahasis, another version of the same story. Actually, multiple versions in Assyrian and Babylonian, using the same name but with a couple differences in detail. Collectively, the different versions of the Epic of Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh both say that the Noah character was instructed to build the ark out of whatever wood and materials he could obtain from dismantling his own house. Both versions also say that it should be about the size of a field, which is understood to be about 230 feet. And both versions say that the length of the vessel should be equal to its width. However, the Epic of Atrahasis clarifies that it should not be cubic nor rectangular, but circular, like the coracles that the Mesopotamians were already commonly using at that time. This shape is also confirmed by both Finkel's and Simmons' additional ark tablets. The scholarly opinion is that Ziusudra already had a coracle, which is like a rounded floating basket which he could punt down the Euphrates, taking his livestock to market until the river flooded, washing him into the Persian Gulf. And that would be the truth of that story, what little there is.
Centuries later, this gets exaggerated into a global worldwide flood, where humans killed in the flood fill the sea like a spawn of fish.
Yes, the global dimensions of the flood is an exaggeration, but the bodies would not be like a spawn of fish, because that would imply that they're still alive. Instead, the goddess Ishtar, also known as Yestra, whom the Easter holiday is named after, protested against the flood, lamenting that no sooner had she given birth to her dear people than they filled the sea like so many fish. Nice to know that even Yestra is a better god than Jehovah.
Both accounts have a god or gods that are sending judgment, describe a worldwide inundation, have an ark built to specific dimensions that are loaded with surviving humans and animals, and land just a few hundred miles apart from each other after using birds as a test to find dry land.
Because, as should be obvious by now, all of these myths are based on the same event, in which Ziusudra survived a localized river flood resulting from a week-long torrent like a hurricane. Now look how much the earliest versions of the story have changed, even though this tale was literally carved in stone for the first 1,000 years or so. Then, when the Mesopotamian Empire fell, there were no more schools teaching how to read and write in cuneiform. So for the next 1,000 years, the ancestors of the biblical authors were illiterate, keeping the old stories alive as an oral tradition, where enhancements and embellishments were inevitable, causing the original relatively modest story to evolve into an exaggerated whopper of biblical proportions.
Myths often grow from being historical to being more mythical, but they almost never develop in the reverse, becoming more truthful and accurate over time. While these accounts mirror each other in so many ways, which account is the original historical one? The feasible one, of course.
No, the older one. Neither of them are feasible. For example, you could compare Genesis 3 to Numbers 22 and say, which is more feasible, whether a snake could talk or whether a donkey could talk. Of the two, it's more likely for a donkey to talk than a snake, but that just means there's more reasons why a talking snake is impossible. But a talking donkey is still impossible too. The flooding of this particular river at that particular time is not just infinitely more feasible, but we have proof that it happened, where we know for certain that the global flood of Noah did not happen.
While both accounts describe plenty of divine intervention, only the biblical ark's size, shape, function, build time, and flood duration makes sense.
Except that, as we've already seen, no part of that story makes any sense at all. All of it is impossible, absurd even. But even if it could happen, by some collection of miracles, we still have mountains of proof from several different fields of study to show that it definitely didn't happen.
Let's see what Dr. Randall Price, distinguished research professor and curator at Liberty Biblical Museum, has to say about this topic.
What extra biblical text would you say substantiate the flood account in Genesis 6 through 9?
Well, let's work our way backwards. We can start with all the church fathers. Every one of them mentioned the flood, and it's always a global flood. There's no example in any of them of a local flood.
So the folks who believe the Bible. Well, of course they do. They didn't know anything about these other older original texts unearthed by archaeologists since then. But the question was not whether the Bible says there was a global flood. The question was, what extra biblical texts, meaning books other than the Bible, substantiate the flood? Because it seems that there aren't any.
And then, as we move back to a first century writer like Flavius Josephus, who wrote for the Romans, he's writing a history of the Jewish people, primarily to impress the Romans because they defeated the Jewish people. It makes them look greater if they defeated a great people. But he's going into the details, and he talks about that in this place where the ark landed, they call it Armenia, they say that there are people who show relics of the ark. There's at least 4 different accounts in Josephus where he says people chip off pieces of the bitumen and make amulets of it, or people are shown these things who are curious to see them.
So still no extra biblical text or evidence of any kind to support the Noah's flood. But instead, we have Josephus repeating the same urban legends that are still being repeated today by dishonest hucksters like Ron Wyatt, who not only claimed to have found the ark, but he also sold artifacts that he said came from it, until he took other creationists up there to show them, and they left in disgust at having been fooled by a dishonest and self-deluded idiot.
Or that all the history of the barbarians, he says, he talks about Egyptian and Chaldean and Greek, all of these have similar accounts of the flood, and he said this was the same as the legislator Moses, he talks about, who wrote.
Except that Moses never existed. He's a composite character made of a handful of people who may or may not have really existed, but he himself was never real. And we know that these other similar accounts are either talking about Ziusudra surviving the flood of Shuruppak, or they're talking about entirely different floods happening in other places at separate times with distinctly different details. There are no extra biblical texts or evidence of any kind to substantiate Noah's flood.
Now we go back in time, and this are those barbarian accounts. We have Sumerian accounts, the Eridu, Genesis. We have the Enuma Elish. We have Atrahasis. We have the Gilgamesh epic. We now have the Simmons Cuneiform tablet, or the Ark tablet. And we have the Sumerian king list. All of these mention the flood and have various details.
All of which also mention the names Ziusudra or Atrahasis and usually identify the city of Shuruppak as well. So we know which flood they're all talking about, and it's not the one from the Bible. So there are extra biblical texts that contradict Noah's flood, but not one to support it.
All of them talk about the gods punishing man, and one man being chosen to bring either himself or his family, or alternately, and certainly in every case, all the animals onto a vessel to survive this flood, this punishment. And then afterward, we have various details. He sent out a dove or a raven, which is like I mentioned in the biblical text. And almost all of them, when he gets off the ark, offers a sacrifice to please the gods. Well, this is not only in the same chronological order as you have in the Bible, but it's the same unique events and details that are in the Bible. Now, all these predate the Bible, and you could accuse the Bible of copying from them, but as we mentioned earlier,
which they obviously did, there's no doubt about that. So I have to wonder, when they ask Dr. Price, what extra biblical texts substantiate the flood? Why doesn't he answer honestly? None. Not one damn thing anywhere ever.
The problem is the Bible comes across more simple, more historical, more believable, while these are complex myths.
No, the biblical exaggeration is definitely the more mythical and by far the least believable of all the flood myths mentioned so far.
And they differ among themselves in those details. But where they all agree is the similar core history that must have been passed on after the flood, and as civilization spread out and generations begin to go their own way, they develop their own myths, which keep that core common history, but add to it in their own direction. The Bible doesn't do it that way. It's not a perception. They're saying this is the way it happened in an orderly event.
Which is exactly how these other myths were depicted too, as orderly events, but with much more vivid detail. The Bible retains only a few of those original details, so that we know that it's just an adaptation exaggerated to the point of falsehood.
And they don't do like these others. They give you clear genealogies. They give you historical time frames. They give you dimensions and structures that are quite literal and actually work.
No, they actually don't work at all. Adding irrelevant and obviously falsely contrived genealogies lends nothing to the credence of all this impossible absurdity. The Bible is no different than these other myths. The only advantage it has is that most of these other versions exist only as rare archaeological fragments of clay tablets, whereas the Bible is a recent revision rewritten on paper.
Okay. So when you look at some of the weird proportions and things of some of these ancient Near Eastern accounts, the ark is a square box that couldn't float. It's a round type of basket that might have done this, or they all have the idea of a boat. But they're too far from the information, whereas the biblical account gives you exact dimensions of something that is hydrodynamically stable, that will fit what it claims. It's no comparison when you come to those things.
The dimensions given for Noah's Ark are not even close to the hydrodynamic stability of Ziusudra's coracle. Look it up.
Jesus taught about a real flood and compared it to what the end times will be like.
Jesus didn't know anything about infectious diseases or microbial pathogens. He believed that diseases were caused by demons. He also apparently believed that the world was flat and that wishes could come true if you could just make believe hard enough. Even in his own time, Jesus was a quack, a first-century faith healer, no more reliable, no more knowledgeable, no more trustworthy than the faith healers we still have scamming people today. So I wouldn't trust his opinion on matters of science, especially when he obviously also didn't know anything about the archaeological precursors of the biblical lore.
Jesus warned, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only."
Was there anything Jesus actually did know? Because he was wrong about a lot of stuff, but is there anything he ever got right?
But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be.
And since then, we've had countless end times come and go, when the world was supposed to end but didn't. And that's happened, or rather failed to happen, dozens of times just while I've been alive. Because you know what prophecies always do? They fail.
Because Jesus stood firmly on the historicity of the flood and likened it to end times, the two go hand in hand. If the Genesis flood never happened, we have no foundation for believing in the rest of what Jesus said, including his second coming.
This was my thinking.
At least for Christians, Matthew alone should destroy the flood as myth idea.
Then let's look at Matthew, and Mark and Luke as well, because it's important to remember that Houdini promised to haunt people that he knew in life to prove the supernatural. But of course he didn't, because he couldn't, because there's no such thing as a soul or an afterlife. And similarly, Jesus said that some, not all, but some of his disciples would not even taste of death until they see Jesus returning in his kingdom. But they've all tasted death since then and ate the whole thing thousands of years ago. And you're still sitting alone at the table eating the breadsticks, wondering why he's late? It's time to accept that you've been stood up. He ain't coming.
Looking back through history, there are actually hundreds of flood accounts, and the similarity between these accounts and the Genesis flood are uncanny. Most of them seem to draw from the same common themes: judgment from God, a family chosen to preserve humanity, and loading animals.
I'm going back to my roots on this one. I started my activism and education advocacy back in the days of Usenet on newsgroups like Talk.Origins, where they have a list of many different flood myths told around the world. Most primitive peoples have been tormented by floods. Those are always dramatic events, so of course everyone has legends about that. But creationists say that means that everyone is telling or remembering the same story, and that's clearly not the case. For example, in Tanzania, they say that the water that is now in the oceans used to belong to one couple who stored it all in a small pot and used that to fill their cups. But a little girl accidentally knocked it over and broke it, spilling out enough water to drown the whole world. In the Congo, they tell a similar story, except then it was an old woman who hoarded all the water until a man came and stole it, accidentally washing everything away in the torrent, including himself. In Kenya, they say that a family of spirits caused a flood with a lake full of beer. A Celtic legend has a flood killing all of humanity except for one couple who were saved on a ship built by a titan. But that was a flood of blood from a giant who was also the sky. He laid down too low, too close to the earth, and the sons of the earth killed the giant of the sky. There are a few of these stories where the flood is attributed to giants or elementals rather than gods, or it might be movements of the world turtle, or a lover's spat in the romantic relationship between the sun and the moon, as if they and the stars had passions and personalities, because all these were written by primitive people who didn't know any better. There's a Turkish tale that Alexander the Great caused the flooding of the Mediterranean Sea by digging a canal all the way from the Black Sea. Kind of like how American folklore said that Pecos Bill dug the Rio Grande by himself. And sometimes these flood myths are about the formation of this world rather than the destruction of the former one. For example, there's a Transylvanian legend that says that men once lived forever in a paradise with rivers of milk and wine where meat grew on trees. But then someone broke a promise, and that caused the rains to come and destroy that world. Several of these floods are said to be caused by broken promises. In Siberia, they say there was a 7-day flood early in human history, and that people saved themselves by clinging to floating logs and such, which drifted in different directions, which is why people are dispersed all over the world now. A Scandinavian legend has an ice giant and his family surviving the flood by floating in a hollowed tree trunk. Their descendants begat the race of ogres. Several of these flood myths attempt to explain why there are seashells in uplifted tectonic strata. Some of these flood legends are meant to explain why there are bones of huge and strange beasts buried in the ground, which is why a Siberian tale describes the woolly mammoth as the prince of animals who arrogantly thought they were too big to drown. Other flood stories were devised to explain why we can still see the ruins of buildings underwater in some places. Gods and fairy folk were an easy excuse back when nobody knew about rising sea levels after the end of the last ice age. And sometimes these magical vandals give a warning. In Cameroon, a brother and sister had to marry each other after a flash flood killed everyone else. These two children only survived because a talking goat warned them that the flood was coming and that they better flee while they could. On the Ivory Coast, a celestial god in disguise told one charitable man who was kind to animals to leave the area because the gods were about to send a flood to drown all the cruel people around him. In one of the Roman flood myths, Zeus and Mercury stood on a hilltop and flooded a whole community except for one house belonging to one of their friends. A Zoroastrian version says that the earth had to be expanded in size a couple of times to accommodate the growing population of people. But when the imaginary boundaries of the earth couldn't be extended anymore, the god Ahura Mazda sent a flood as population control. And some of the floods described were apparently based on real events according to the accounts of survivors, although all of them were exaggerated with folklorish embellishments added over time. In many of them, people survived by clinging to trees or floating debris or hiding out on high mountains. Otherwise, they survived by hiding inside a gourd or a seashell or a nutshell. The Greeks say a Titan survived by floating in a chest for 9 days. The same tale is told in Rome also, so it must be true, right? Sometimes it's a boat or a raft. An Indonesian story says that a pregnant woman survived by using a pig's trough as a boat, which she rowed with a soup ladle. Then she bore a son whom she had to marry once he grew up because they were the only people left on earth. Every story where the whole world floods such that only one couple survives has to endorse incest, and that awkward topic ought to keep most kids from asking embarrassing questions, especially if they're sitting next to their siblings when the story is told. But anyone who does question has to wonder what happened to the animals, since they would have drowned too. In a legend from the Ural Mountains, a few people and giants survived in different boats. Then when they saw that the animals had all drowned, they prayed to their God who created the animals all over again, just like Yahweh could have done, easier than getting all the animals in the world into one boat. There's a Persian legend opposite that, wherein the world before the flood was full of noxious beasts created by the evil Ahriman, the earliest version of the devilish Satan. Thus, one of the stars, who also happened to be a rain god, brought on 3 successive rainstorms lasting 10 days each to rid the world of these malevolent monsters. Maybe this is another attempt to explain fossils. Of course, the most obvious and convenient plot device is that someone had a boat. Sometimes it's even a ship that someone had either already built or that the gods provided. Because if the gods can create planets and animals and everything else, they ought to be able to come up with something as simple as a boat. But for some reason, the Jewish God can make everything that people can't make, but he can't make anything people can make. So we have to do all his work, building the ark and the tabernacle and following precise instructions on how to dress his priests in fine garments decorated with precious materials, just like it would be if God were only imaginary. And most of these tales have no connection to Noah's Ark or the Jewish God, but some of them are recent enough and near enough to have borrowed from Semitic tradition. Sometimes there's even a story about how the devil snuck aboard Noah's Ark to survive the flood. The bit about sending out 2 or more birds is common too. The first is usually interpreted to be a dove, but the second bird may be a raven, a hawk, or a vulture, although the order can change. And my favorite of all of these legends is from China, wherein a defeated warrior climbs up a mountain tall enough that he can reach the firmament. Then, in an attempted murder-suicide, he tears a hole in the sky with his spear, and this causes all the water above the firmament to flood onto the earth below. Then the Naga goddess, Nu Kwa, had to patch the hole in the sky and dry up the flood. As you can see, Nu Kwa is also a creatrix who fashioned the first people out of clay, just like in some other ancient myths.
The early Chinese certainly seemed to have Genesis and the flood in mind when they invented written language.
Together with the Jews, Chinese is one of the earliest and the oldest enduring civilizations. It has 4,500 years of unbroken history. Every Chinese word not only expresses a meaning, it captures a history. Every character tells a story. And that the Chinese people were the descendants of the Tower of Babel. They were the descendants of Noah. Surely they want to record all these global cataclysmic events. So I'm going to show you that all these global events were documented in Chinese history. Now notice, watch everybody.
每一个人仔细看啊。
God took clay to.
神拿了尘土起来。
He breathed with his mouth.
用口吹气进去。
On 2 people, one is a man.
2个人身上，一个是一个人啊，男人。
Out of his side came forth a woman.
从他身旁出来了女人，
and put them in a garden.
把他们放在这个范围里。
That's how you get the word garden. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. So God stopped them,
神拦阻他们，
prohibited them.
禁止他们。
Now, to forbid in Chinese is this word 禁. Now, how do you write the word 禁? Now, look. God put them in a garden. You have trees.
神给他们放在园子里面，有这个树林在，
He gave them a revelation. 启示。
还把启示告诉他们这个柿子。
God gave them revelation about the tree.
神给他们这树木的启示，
Don't you eat it.
不要吃哦，
If you eat it, you will die.
你吃的话必定死。
Why were there 2 trees?
为什么放2棵树呢？
Because there was a tree of life and a tree of knowledge of good and evil. Genesis chapter 3 verse 1 now. Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. Now, what is the word tempter in Chinese? The person who gives temptation. It's this word. Look. Now, how do you write the word more? One guy came to man.
他来找人了，那个儿子
Secretly.
私下的
This is the word.
私，
Si means secret.
这个私就是秘密的意思。
So this word 鬼 means devil. Where did he come?
他到哪儿去？
He came to among the trees.
他是在树林当中来的，
Undercover.
在林荫之下。
He came as a tempter. So he tried to seduce Eve. Eve, eat the fruit.
夏娃吃着果子，
Eve, the Bible says, lusted after the fruit, got greedy for it. How do you write the word to lust? Notice is again those three over a woman. All the story of creation was recorded in their writings. Now we come to the flood in Genesis chapter 7. So Noah with his sons, his wife, and his son's wives went into the ark because of the waters of the flood. What is the Chinese word for a big boat? 船. How do you write 船? Look, 写这里.
船这个字怎么写的？你看啊，
A 舟, a boat.
啊，这就是一艘船，舟
With 8 people, 8.
里面有8口人。
You say, why 8 people in the boat? Because chapter 7 and verse 7 says, Noah and his wife, 2 people, 3 sons, that makes it 5, and 3 daughter-in-laws, that's 8. The first time boat was used, 8 people were inside.
Where did the Chinese picture concepts come from? Why do these figures match Genesis history so clearly?
Maybe I should personally address all of this, but Potholer 54 already did an excellent job with this, and I'm one of those who thinks that you shouldn't remake something if we can't do it significantly better than the first time was. All I could do was say the same thing he did, so let's just have him say it.
This is the Chinese written language. Of course, they use pictographs, images that they will use different to make up different words, and then they'll combine them together to make sentences and
new words.
This type of thing. Yeah. And so, it's very interesting that the Chinese word for tower is grass plus clay plus mankind plus one mouth. Everyone speaking one way, one language.
Ooh, that actually sounds very convincing. Except it's complete bullshit. These elements are called components, and it's true you can often dissemble simple characters and get the meaning based on these. For example, this is the character for a person, here in the form of a component called a radical, and here's the character for a tree. So if you have a person leaning against a tree, you have a character that means to rest. Get it? Characters like this are called associative. But this one isn't associative, so you can't simply add up the various components and make your own little story. This type of character is called pictophonetic, because while one component, the radical, gives a hint of the meaning, the other component is purely there to indicate the sound. We'll come to that in a minute. First, let's embarrass creation ministries by showing not only how they don't understand the difference between associative and pictophonetic characters, they don't even understand what the components in their example mean. The key radical in the character for tower is this one, meaning earth. It stands to reason because that's what early Chinese towers were made of. But what's next to it is an archaic character that has 2 meanings, a small bean and thick. If we break it down, it's composed of the radicals for grass, and this very common character meaning combine or unite. But if we break it down further, Creationist Ministries is completely wrong in saying that this radical, meaning one, combines with a mouth to mean one voice. It doesn't. It goes with the radical ji, a person, to give us the meaning one people. So one people at a gate gives us the character he, meaning assemble or come together. Get it? Nothing to do with one language at all. But the whole exercise is pointless anyway, because as I said, this is a pictophonetic character. This component is there to guide you towards the right pronunciation, which I hasten to add is not necessarily the one I've given you. To use English as an analogy, the letter T in the word Britain is there because it tells you how to pronounce the word Britain. It's not some secret code telling you ancient Britons used to drink tea. How do we know this? Because scholars have been studying these characters for hundreds of years, and we can even see how they've evolved. The first Chinese dictionary was published nearly 2,000 years before the first English one. Let me give a parallel example in English. The word cupboard is a compound word, the equivalent of an associative Chinese character, because it puts two words together, cup and board, to describe something quite literally. Even if you didn't know what a cupboard was, you could take the word apart and figure it out. But you can't do that with most English words because they're purely phonetic. You can't take the word ketchup and assume that each component is telling the story of a sailing boat being lifted into heaven, because that would be stupid, right, creationists? This desperate attempt to link Chinese characters to biblical stories has become a favourite among creationists, especially this one.
The Chinese word for create is zao.
To create, or creation.
The character for create.
Create in Chinese is the word zao.
Before we hear more, let me first explain that this character, once again, is pictophonetic. So while this radical walk indicates the meaning, the second component, which means to tell, is purely there to indicate the sound. But let's watch as creationists unravel the character anyway. I'm going to press a buzzer whenever they make a mistake. Okay, here we go.
So we have dust.
It is made up of dust.
Okay, this part.
No, this part isn't a part. I know it would be nice if there was a character for dust in there, because then it would fit the narrative, but there isn't. This is the four-stroke radical for a cow.
Don't try to ignore this small stroke, because it means alive or to live.
Sorry, but putting this and this together to invent some radical meaning living dust not found in any Chinese dictionary is a complete load of baloney. The reason Chinese scholars know this is a cow, and any Chinese etymological dictionary will tell you it's a cow, is because the character zao, meaning build or make, has been written for thousands of years, and its evolution has been documented. Here's one of the oldest inscriptions dating back to the Bronze Age, showing that the pictograph is a cow. That's what the character for a cow looked like back then. And even though the length of the vertical stroke has shortened over the centuries, it's still a cow. If I had a carton of Chinese milk, I could show you. Oh, here's one. See? Cow! So in the character for build or make, this doesn't mean dust, this doesn't mean life, and this doesn't even mean a man. As we've seen, it means a mouth or an entrance. You get all three wrong, and still have the balls to tell me this made-up crap is in the Bible. What a load of
Isn't it also interesting that all human history disappears about the same time as the biblical flood?
Isn't it interesting how religious apologists will constantly and shamelessly lie in defense of their faith? Knowing, for example, that human history does not disappear at the supposed time of the flood, but remains in stoic contradiction to it.
Even secular school textbooks admit this.
No, they don't. Note the image, implying that writing is less than 6,000 years old and implying that the flood happened 6,000 years ago. Both of these are wrong. Answers in Genesis, the Institute for Creation Research, and Creation.com all agree that the flood happened sometime in the 24th century BCE, which is nearly 4,400 years ago, not 6,000. According to the International Encyclopedia of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Sumerian cuneiform can be traced without any discontinuity over a period of 10,000 years, all the way back to the 8th millennium BCE, as it evolved from an accounting system of clay tokens to pictographs and finally phonetic text more than 1,000 years before your mythic flood.
This is exactly what we would expect with civilization starting again after the flood.
But of course, that's not what happened. Look at the image that was just shown. The Greeks hadn't begun much of their history by then, and the Hittites were at that time still the Hatti, an aboriginal tribe of Anatolia, but the rest of these had written histories and kept records long before and continuously through and beyond the global flood that never was. In China, Emperor Shun, the last of the 5 emperors, takes over after Emperor Yao. Sargon of Akkad is alive at this time, conquering Sumer in a string of wars that end their early dynastic period. In Egypt, it was the end of the 5th dynasty and the beginning of the 6th. Pharaoh Teti took as his queen a daughter of the previous Pharaoh Unas. And this is the pyramid where Teti is buried. And we know all of this because the Egyptians developed their own written language separate from everyone else. And they kept on keeping on right through your flood as if it never happened. This is exactly what we would expect if Noah's flood was just a Hollywood fabrication that is only loosely inspired by a historic event.
In summary, the Bible clearly lays out a flood account that, while miraculous, fits into history with much more believability than the mythical accounts.
In conclusion, quit pretending that all these ancient originals that all sound just like each other are somehow copies of the new revised exaggeration that just came out recently. We know better. You know better than that. And let me remind you that we have plenty of archaeological and textual evidence to show when and where Ziusudra's flood actually happened. And we know and can prove that every aspect of Noah's flood is absolutely impossible, a fictional fabrication, a fable of nothing but nonsense.